For several years now, John Leguizamo has been on a mission to tell the untold story or history of Latinos and their contributions to America. I would say about a year and a half ago, he presented a docuseries on this history. Now he's back at it again. This time he decided to put this on PBS. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't have a problem with anyone representing their race or ethnicity. That's not my issue at all. But it appears to me he's trying to rewrite the history of Black Americans by centering Latinos as the agent for social justice and civil rights. There was so much said in this recent documentary that I decided to respond to just a few of the points raised in the documentary. I did a video on John Leguizamo more than a year and a half ago. That particular video is still on my channel, and it focused on Latinos' involvement in the Civil War. In that video, I broke down some of the misleading narratives presented in that documentary. Now let's hear from John himself, who will invite us to explore the untold story of Latino history.
You know, when I was growing up in Jackson Heights, Queens, I learned the same history that they taught kids all over America. That George Washington cut down his cherry tree, that Ben Franklin flew his kite, and Abe was honest. Guess what was missing? Us, the Latino contributions to this country.
You can't have a history book about the United States without considering the histories of all of the Latino communities.
Most of the history we're still taught is from the point of view of the conquistadors who tried to wipe out any trace of advanced indigenous cultures. As a kid, that lack of inclusion in history textbooks made me feel invisible.
I think it's essential that we set the record straight about Latinx history.
Well, with the strike and with the boycott, we were trying to get farm workers basic human rights.
We don't just make contributions to U.S. history, we have changed U.S. history.
Latinos are the most highly decorated ethnic group in U.S. military history.
People tend to forget that Latinos were here long before the United States existed.
If we consider the richness of our past, we are able to reconstruct a much richer picture of how our cultures came to be.
It's important to not underestimate the people that came before us and what they knew.
They invented life-saving medical practices and engineered incredible infrastructure. They also calculated the movements of the planets, and they wrote it all down in their sacred books. It's as epic as any of the great wonders you've learned about in history class. This is the story from the point of view of the people who are already living in the Americas.
And this is really important for Latinos to know and for other people to know about Latino roots.
Imagine how others would see us if they knew our rich history. Imagine how we would see ourselves if we knew our own stories. So we're going to fill in the parts of our history that were lost, all the way from the ancient Olmecs to the Latinos who helped build this great nation. I know that's a lot of ground to cover, but don't worry, because I got you.
Of all the things that are mentioned in that lead-in, I just want to focus my attention on the claim that Latinos were on the front lines of civil rights.
And yet, we were the first to fight against segregation in 1911, the Maestas family in Denver, Colorado, and they won. Sylvia Mendes fought against segregation in 1940 and won, paved the way for Brown versus Board of Ed. We didn't fight for just our rights, but for the rights of all. And Latinas often led that charge.
Well, did they actually lead the charge for all people, including Black Americans? The history doesn't suggest that. In this documentary, he seems to suggest that if it were not for the efforts of Mexican Americans, the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education may not have materialized. So in this video, what we're going to do is talk about a few of these cases that John Leguizamo highlights in his documentary. Now, the reason why I believe that these few cases are so inconsequential to the success of Brown versus the Board of Education, because it rests on the fact that Mexican Americans were considered white. So, before I take a look at some of those cases, let's take a look at the history of how Mexican Americans became white. This bit of information will help us understand how many of these cases were successfully won in the courts over the desegregation of schools. So, how did Mexican Americans become white? Let's take a look. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo granted Mexican Americans citizenship of the United States and classified them as white by law in 1848 after the Mexican American War. Okay, now this is how the history goes. When America started their western expansion, they rented land from Mexico to institute slavery. This land that I'm talking about in particular is what we now know as Texas. So, several conflicts happened between Mexico and the new settlers, which ultimately led to the Mexican-American War. So, as a result of Mexico losing that war, America attained California, Nevada, Colorado, Mexico, Arizona, and of course, Texas. This treaty allowed Mexicans living in the new acquired territories to keep their property and be classified as white American citizens, because in 1848, only white men could be classified as citizens of the United States. Although Mexican Americans experienced various degrees of discrimination, their participation in many social settings was not hampered by the Jim Crow laws that Black people were subjected to. Remember, they were classified as white. So they were better than Black, so they had some access that Black Americans simply didn't have. The foundation of these highly discriminatory laws rests on the Supreme Court case we all heard, Plessy versus Ferguson, which federally mandated the policy of separate but equal. Only Black Americans were lawfully impacted by these laws. Other groups were not bound to these laws. The degree that other groups were discriminated varied based on the feelings of individual white people and establishments. In this social caste system at that time, Mexican Americans fared much better than Black Americans. Mexican Americans at that time in the early 20th century was living in a very precarious social status, right? On one hand, they were classified as white, even though they knew that white people didn't really see them as white. So they were basically subjected to second-class treatment. But it was a delicate walk for them because they didn't want to come across too offensive to white people, that they would in some way see them as Black. And you definitely don't want to be seen as Black.
We got a clip that speaks to this white versus non-white, and if I'm going to be white, why am I not being treated like other people who are white and are not Latino? So here's clip 4, guys.
Mexican Americans were fighting to be treated as if they were white. But the irony here is that the Texas courts seized on their claim to be white, not to treat them fairly, but to continue to defend this practice of unfair mistreatment.
I think many Mexican Americans were afraid. What would happen if we weren't considered white? How do we know we're not going to be forced or pushed to identify with the Black race at a time when Black people are fundamentally denied so many basic rights? But there's also the element of racism, of the belief among some Mexican Americans that Blackness is inferior. So there's an element of racism and there's an element of fear of Jim Crow segregation.
While this particular speech is mostly talking about white people, it somehow speaks to the mindset of Mexican Americans at that time. Check it out.
But what is happening in the poor woman, the poor man's mind, is this. They've been raised to believe, and by now they helplessly believe, that no matter how terrible their lives may be, and their lives have been quite terrible, and no matter how far they fall, no matter what disaster overtakes them, they have one enormous knowledge and consolation, which is like a heavenly revelation. At least they are not black. Now I suggest that of all the terrible things that can happen to a human being, that is one of the worst.
All right, let me give you a brief summary of two cases that John Leguizamo mentions in his documentary. Let's start with this first case. This is a picture of Miguel Meatas. And the case we're going to talk about is called Meatas versus Schoen. All right, now this is about a Mexican-American family who happens to live on the Angle side of town, a small town in Colorado. This is around 1911, 12, or 13 in this period of time, early 20th century. So they went to a school closest to them to enroll their child. This school happens to be where white kids go. They were told that their son had to go to the Mexican school, which was on the other side of the railroad tracks. Now, the reason that the school district denied their son entry to the school was basically due to their belief, at least this is what they're saying to the family, that Mexican children are not proficient in English, so they probably wouldn't do well at that school. Now, the real reason probably was because they were Mexican, but they could not say that it's because he was Mexican, because Mexicans were considered white at that time. So they made up this whole notion that it was about English. All right, so the family was clearly upset about it, right? Why should their kid have to travel a long distance to go to school where there's a school very close to them, right? So they sued the school. And so this particular case appeared in a local district court, all right? So the judge called several students to the stand to test their command or proficiency in English. Miguel Meatas was one of those students who testified, and all the kids did well. The judge ruled that they had no basis, the school district had no basis to prevent Meatas' kid from enrolling in the school. Now, this ruling was a local district court. I keep mentioning that. It was a local, it was not a state ruling or a federal ruling. So it only affected the kids in that district. All right? So let's talk about Sylvia Mendez. Now, this is the case of Mendez versus Westminster. All right, so here's the story. They too sought to enroll. Now, this is happening in the 40s in California. All right, so they sought to enroll their children in a school near them. Right. However, a result of her darker hue, Sylvia was denied enrollment. Now, what happened was Sylvia's aunt took her kids and Sylvia and her brother to enroll in this particular school. Her aunt's children were of a lighter hue, and their surname wasn't Hispanic. But Sylvia was of a darker hue, and her last name or her surname was Hispanic. So she was denied. Now, needless to say, her parents were pretty upset with that. And so they filed a class action lawsuit to integrate this school, to allow her child to be able to go to this school. So basically, the judge's decision ultimately said that separate but equal was not a good policy. Interesting. Now, at the same time, separate but equal was federally mandated for Black people. But he ordered California schools to desegregate their schools and allow Mexican kids to go to any school, at least in their area. Now, some seem to suggest that the Mendez versus Westminster provided the roadmap for Brown versus Board of Ed. I kind of have a problem with that because unlike Black Americans, Mexican Americans didn't have the obstacle of Plessy versus Ferguson. And so it made it easier for them to integrate, where at this very same time that she was allowed, Sylvia and other Hispanics were allowed to go to the school of their choice, Black children were still not allowed because there was a federal law preventing us from doing so. Some of you might be unaware that Thurgood Marshall also was one of the lead attorneys on Mendez versus Westminster. But let me describe what kind of work he was doing even prior to the overturning of Plessy versus Ferguson. Here we go. Marshall was the key strategist in the effort to end racial segregation, in particular meticulously challenging Plessy versus Ferguson, the court-sanctioned legal doctrine that called for separate but equal structures. Marshall won a series of court decisions that gradually struck down that doctrine, ultimately leading to Brown versus Board of Education, which he argued before the Supreme Court in 1952 and 1953, finally overturning separate but equal and acknowledging that segregation greatly diminishes students' self-esteem. I think it's important to keep this in mind. There was a lot of things going on after Brown versus the Board of Education. It took nearly 3 to 7 years before Black students were fully able to integrate into public schools. Please understand that, because there was a lot of people fighting against that through all that time. All right? So, such as the case is like this. In 1957, Texas legislatures drafted a plethora of segregationist legislation designed to circumvent the Brown v. Board of Education decision outlawing school segregation. Mexican Americans and African American civil rights activists quickly organized to prevent these bills from passing. Now check this out. But when a few Mexican Americans associated with the League of United Latin American Citizens, which we know as LULAC, suggested working with Blacks in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, LULAC's national president, Felix Tijerina, sternly reprimanded his colleagues, saying, "Let the Negro fight his own battles. His problems are not mine. I don't want to ally with him." So much for the Brown and Black coalition. But thankfully, this former Mexican-American congressperson is going to set the record straight.
The civil rights movement impacted my life in many ways. My older brother fought in the Korean War. He was a proud American veteran who fought for our country with valor and honor. Upon returning from the war, he came back to Texas. One day, he walked into a restaurant for lunch, wearing a military uniform. When he tried to sit at the table, the owner told him that if he wanted to eat at the restaurant, he would have to eat his meal in the back of the restaurant. My brother stormed out of the restaurant and never went back. Here was an Army paratrooper who had defended his country proudly, and they wouldn't even let him eat at a table in that restaurant. I will never forget him telling that story to his brothers and sisters at the dinner table. His anger and frustration were palpable. Moments like that, the struggles of my brother and others who suffered in the civil rights movement, inform the work I do today as a member of Congress. The Hispanic community has benefited tremendously from the civil rights movement of the 1960s. When I was growing up, my father and my older brothers had to pay a poll tax. This poll tax was maybe $1.50 or $2.50, which was a lot of money back then, and was essentially a tax for any minority who wanted to vote. Without the civil rights movement and without the March on Washington, we may still be dealing with those same problems today. As chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, I am committed to many of the same ethos that were exemplified by the March on Washington and the civil rights movements. The quest for equality is at the very heart of the work we conduct in the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. I am very proud of the work that we continue to do with the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Asian and Pacific Islander Caucus. The fact remains, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus exists today because of the doors that were opened by civil rights leaders who marched on Washington.
All right, family. Thumb up the video. Make sure you share this video. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Until the next time, peace.